So I'm Silke Schmickl. I'm the curator at the Institute of Contemporary Arts at La Salle, College of the Arts. But in my previous life, I was the co-founding director of a curatorial platform called Low Wave, based in Paris and recently also Singapore. So I was very delighted when you approached me from the Asian Film Archive to present you a project that I conducted last year together with my Low Wave colleagues, Jeremy Chua, Michael Robert Gonçalves, and also Patricia Cartier-Millon. So we are a very small team, but we collaborated also with other intellectuals, such as Catherine David, the deputy director of the Musée d'Art Moderne at the Pompidou Center, and also French film professor Nicole Brenes for the film programs, to compose a quite ambitious project called Singapore Mon Amour, which was an interdisciplinary project that we organized in collaboration with various art scenes in Singapore. Art venues, sorry. So the context of this project was a big festival of Singaporean art in France called Singapore Le Festival, which was organized conjointly by the National Heritage Board Singapore and also Institut Français. And the idea of these bigger manifestations is to introduce a national art scene to the French art scene. I think the principle goes back probably to this idea of the World Expo, where we invite partners to present their best cultural highlights. I'm personally always a bit critical when it comes to that kind of mechanisms, because I grew up in a country where nationalism after World War II in Germany was not so popular, I guess. But still, it provides a good opportunity, of course, for all kind of artistic experimentations to be shown in Paris and other cities of France. So maybe just to my own background, so I'm not a film historian, I'm also not really a specialist of Southeast Asia or Filipino or Singaporean cinema, but I have a strong background in art films, experimental film and video art, because with this platform Low Wave, I've been working for 15 years with emerging art scenes, notably the Middle East, Africa, also India, and more recently Asia, since 2011, when I was invited for the first time by the Substation to participate in their first experimental film forum. So in these regional projects that I did with Low Wave, I never had a conscious interest in building a national or composing a national program. The films of artworks I'm interested in are rather the opposite. They speak an international language, like I believe any good art form should do. But if you create a specific context, like we did for Singapore Mon Amour, of course, all these works brought together allow a reconsideration also of a national art or film language. So actually my project Singapore Mon Amour was part of the off section of the festival, because as you will discover very quickly, we really focused on the independent art scene in Singapore. And we wanted also maybe to highlight this other facet that was not necessarily presented by the official program of that festival. To give you an idea, for example, one of the biggest successes of the festival was a hawker center that they installed along the Seine River. So this was a huge success. People loved the food, but we were really trying to show something else of Singaporean art. So just to give you maybe a short insight in how we worked together with Nicole Brenes on the film selection. It took us around 1 year, and we were going through different channels to see as many different film productions as possible. So we started, of course, with film distributors such as Objectives, or also the Asian Film Archive, through whom we found, for example, Rajendra Ghosh films. But we also worked with contemporary art galleries, such as OTA Fine Arts, who had a beautiful film by Zai Kuning that we were interested in showing. And then also, of course, friends, artist friends, filmmaker friends, who recommended us works, and also other curators, as well as also the internet. So our initial research was really large, and we were interested also in not sticking necessarily to films that we had seen in other festivals before. So this process was really long, and we selected out of these 100 films, 28 works that we decided to organize in 4 different programs. So I just give you quickly the titles of these programs. So the first one was focusing on geography and history of Singapore, so it was called Un peu de géographie et d'histoire. The second one was titled Labor of Life. The third one, Encounters with Art Often Seem Like a Moment of Fiction, a quotation from Ken Chan, one of his films. And the fourth program was a homage to Tan Pin Pin, so this was a monographic program. Each of these programs contained a hybrid mix of formats ranging from video art to experimental films to documentaries, also some fictions, abstract works, in order to illustrate a variety of genre in contemporary Singaporean art film, and also to include various types of storytelling around one subject. So I would just quickly like to quote the first introduction paragraph of Nicole Brunet's text for La Cinémathèque's program brochure. She wrote, "Seen from Europe, the genius of Singapore is in its formidable power of circulation between the 64 islands and the archipelago and the rest of the world. Within dense interlacing of communities and cultures, the flow of material and immaterial goods constantly grows and accelerates, articulated by a sudden historical movement, commonly summarized by the official syntagma from mangrove to metropolis, that rendered, commensurate with urbanization, visible layers of each step of development. Amongst the symbolic assets of the city circulates also its images. The usual representations of Singapore as a natural paradise or as a conquering city-states, an outlook for economic or architectural modernity, are yet challenged by more complex, elegant, and sometimes unexpected propositions expressed by a generation of visual artists, both critical and constructive. What news are these authors sending us from Singapore? What forms of descriptions, definitions, dynamics do these artists invent, eager to share various observations of their territory with the rest of the world? We searched their works for both documentary dimensions and logics of projections on the past, the present, and possible futures. If each work offers the singularity of its own perspective on Singapore, together their images consolidate to form an additional chain of islands in the archipelago, a prismatic hub that where findings and values, memories and innovations, profound schemes of ancient tales and phenomenal beauties of astonishing visual initiatives are exchanged." So just to give you a bit of the tone of Nicole's point of view on this. Nicole is not a specialist of Singaporean cinema, but she is one of the big figures of experimental film cinema, and she's running the avant-garde film programs at La Cinémathèque. So it was interesting for us also to have different point of views during the curatorial process itself. So I would like to show you the trailer of the first program that deals more with the history and geography, to give you just an idea of the texture of works that we have selected.
Beliau yang mempunyai berbagai nama, Sang Nila Utama. Siapakah sebenarnya beliau yang dipanggil Utama? Tiada apa yang pasti, kecuali seseorang telah menamakan tanah ini Kota Singa atau Singapura.
Singapore's state government was sworn in at City Hall by the head of state, Inche Yusof bin Ipat.
So what I forgot to mention before, just coming back quickly to the title, Singapore Mon Amour. So this title was actually inspired by Alain René's film, Hiroshima Mon Amour, which is a film that was very important in my own development, I think. And what fascinated me always in this film is how it connects the East and the West, this encounter between this French actress that meets a Japanese man, and how through their personal history they also tackle the bigger history, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and also the effects of World War II. So what I found interesting for our project is, what I really wanted to do is to create as many possible personal conversations between the French and Singaporean participants in order to attack these bigger questions of national pasts and so on, really on that very personal level, and something that should also grow. So like the film, this project is not anti-patriotic, it's also not patriotic. It's really a way of looking at Singapore from the inside, because we collaborated really very closely with the artists and intellectuals, but from always this independent perspective, in order to avoid all the stereotypes that we know already about Singapore. So coming back now to this particular film program that I have selected because it deals more with this question of nation building. We started the film with Rajendra Gore's Sunshine Singapore, which is part of the Asian Film Archives collection, because we wanted to start as early as possible in that genre of experimental film. So this was the oldest film that we found. At that time, Rajendra just moved from India, where he was trained in Bollywood in the film industry, to Singapore to start a career here, rather a TV career. But he bought his own cameras and started experimenting with the Super 8 format. And this is actually the second film he made. We also showed the first film, which is called The Eye. So we were interested in this film because of the independence of production, somebody who just produced this film in his personal environment, and also the enthusiasm that this film carries. The film is made in the late 60s, just a few years after the independence, so it's an extremely positive portrait of Singapore where things seem possible, and this is also reflected in the soundscape, which is inspired actually by a song that he liked a lot. So the editing and the filming follows very much the rhythm of this, this period of his life that was extremely positive. The next film of the program is Ho Chun Yen's Utama, Every Name in History is I. I think many of you have probably seen this film, and I will screen later today part of the artist talk that we organized with Chun Yen at the Pompidou Center, where he speaks more about the motivations behind this particular work. But we like the contrast that moving from something very positive, coming from Rajendra, the modern Singapore, to this film that introduces a notion of doubt. All of a sudden, there is a filmmaker who revisits the myth of the founding of Singapore, this emblematic figure of Prince Utama, where not so much is actually known about, but who gave the name to this city-state. So more details about this film will come later. Then we moved to Tan Pin Pin's 9th of August, which is a found footage film where she revisited 41 years of National Parade documentations. So the images actually come from the National Archive, and she rearranged them critically. I will show you an extract later. But it's really a beautiful work that speaks also about modern Singapore, but from a very different perspective than Rajendra. And then the next crucial film is Riau by Sai Kuning. So this film that we got from Ota Fine Arts, a beautiful journey where he spent time with the Orang Laut, the sea gypsies who live in the Straits of Malacca between Singapore and Sumatra, and a very time-consuming procedure also of producing that film, because he had to wait for these people to come by to discover their village. So it's again a beautiful example of a personal investigation that connects to the bigger history. And of course this film was essential because it speaks about the time before modern Singapore and even before the colonization of the British. So also in that sense it connected the program to the bigger region of Southeast Asia, which was of course very important as well. The next film by Kevin Fong, Sunset of Another World, is really just a short haiku, sort of a visual poem where he revisits the act of independence and mixes these historical images with personal images of a sunset that he filmed in Singapore when moving back from New York. And then the last film in this program is by Zekai Liao, also a film that many of you have probably seen. It was part of the Singapore Biennale in 2013. And also a very interesting way to revisit the history of Singapore through the island of St. John's that had various functions in the past. So it was a quarantine center for immigrants that came back from Mecca, a penal colony for political detainees and secret society leaders, and then finally a sleepy holiday resort. So we really appreciated that film for the different layers of history reading that it introduces in one singular work. So if I focus today on this program, it's not that the other ones are less important, because, for example, program number 2 was focused more on social structures of Singapore and also themes such as homosexuality, feminism, and it included many films about daily life in Singapore. The third program, sorry, I don't have the website here, dealt much more with political aspects, freedom of speech, freedom of expression. We have here, for example, an example again by Ho Tsun Yen, 4x4 episode 3, Tang Da Wu, The Most Radical Gesture, where he restaged a performance by Tang Da Wu. Fabulous film that had not been shown in France before, so we were happy also to include in this program some of these more political works. And then the last one, of course, Tan Pin Pin, with her investigational documentaries, also a very intensive political work on the Singaporean history and landscape. We wanted also to include To Singapore with Love in this program, but we were not allowed to screen it because we were under NHB money. So there were, of course, this whole selection is incomplete, and if I would have to do it again today, I would add also more films and hopefully extend the whole selection. If we look at the film programs as a whole, we can see that there are different strategies, artistic strategies that the filmmakers employed, which interested me very much during this research. So I already mentioned Rajendra Gore's film, who we had really selected for this independence of production. And there are, of course, other films that I could also mention in this regards. For example, the film by Zai Kuning as well, Sukun Ang, Lu Sehan, Nelson Yeoh, some of Zekai's films, and also some of Pin Pin's film, where, of course, this independence of production allows a total freedom of expression. So these films generally have a lower chance of getting distributed because they can't rely on any distributors or whatever. But a platform such as Singapore Mon Amour is probably the perfect occasion for these films to enter a dialogue and to speak to a wider audience. A second strategy that was quite common for this program were the use of found footage material. So we already saw a short extract of Tan Pin Pin's 9th of August, and I would invite you now to look at a longer extract of 2 minutes. Yeah, so it's one chapter of the film. The whole film is 8 minutes long, and I have chosen this particular sequence that illustrates the strength and power of Singapore and all these national symbols that go along. But there are also other parts in the film where she focuses more on the choreography of all these parades, and so it's a really interesting way of rearranging these materials that were filmed by the public TV. So I think that is one of the most interesting parts about these found footage films, that two visions come together, the vision of the original document filmed by someone else, and then the critical arrangement through, in this case, Pin. There was another important work with found footage by Ulrich Lau, the Orators Monologue, where he uses film extracts from Citizen Kane, Charlie Chaplin, and also Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, and added a subtext. So this film, for example, to my knowledge, has never been shown in a cinematographic context before. It was really more an artwork that was usually shown in art galleries. So we had a couple of these examples, and when I thought about it this morning again, I think in these found footage films there is also kind of a shared responsibility. So the artist has not shot the films, he has chosen a material that he reuses. So this can be also kind of an interesting strategy to be a bit safe, because the material that is employed is actually coming from someone else. There was a third category that was quite interesting. These were the films that are based on reenactment, so the restaging of existing events or cinema scenes that were, in our case, also talking about some historical facts in Singapore. There was, I mentioned already, Sun Yen's film on Tang Da Wu's performance, but there was also Jason Su's film, a short film on the May 13 generation that is based on student riots in the Chinese high school on 30th of May in 54, where 800 students demonstrated against this new circumscription law and organized themselves during 3 weeks to still conduct their classes, but to also conduct political actions in school. So I have another extract of this film to show you one of the crucial scenes.
5月13日，我们在皇家山公园。
这是个和平的集会，共有上千个学生，也不是一场示威，没有标语牌，没有口号，没有叫喊。
我们空手而来，没有刀，没有石头，什么都没有。我们只是在支持我们的学生代表，向政府呈交我们的免疫请愿书。
是他们竟出动政报队打我们。
解散！解散！这是命令。
我们开始唱团结就是力量。
团结，团结就是力量。
团结，团结就是力量。团结，团结就是力量。团结就是力量。
他揪着我的脖子，拉我的裤子，硬要把我拖出去。
他们用绳子套住我的脖子，他们用警棍敲打我的头。
他们派了300位武装的警察，配着盾牌，持着警棍，荷枪实弹殴打我们。我一直跑，一直跑，一直跑。
为中正集合！
同志华夏运动会同学们，
打倒学生！打倒学生啊！
So as you can see, there is also, again, a use of found footage materials or press clippings in this film, but most of the film is really restaged by these young high school students to reenact the stories that he had collected during his research. This film always reminded me somehow of Bertolt Brecht's theater, where the fiction is constantly interrupted, and he always creates this awareness that we are looking at a representation of something, of a historical event, and that we as spectators should stay critical in regards to what we are seeing and not getting just I don't know, sleepy when entering this fiction. The last strategy that I could highlight for this particular program is the use of science fictional elements. I think this is always also something that allows you to speak about current events in your country without being too direct, just by placing the events in another time, in another space, and to include also some futuristic projections. So one of my favorite Singaporean films in recent years would be Snakeskin by Daniel Hui. I think it's a brilliant work that deals with these science fictional elements based yet on documentary images that he shot in Singapore. Due to the restriction of Cinémathèque Française, we just had 4 slots. We couldn't include another longer film, but this is definitely a film that is totally part of what we try to do with Singapore Mon Amour. And then, of course, we have other films like Sun Yen's The Cloud of Unknowing, for example, where he introduces this element of the cloud in a very common or usual Singaporean environment and creates that strangeness where all of a sudden reality is alienated. And a couple of other films, also by Nelson Yeo, for example, who is someone who also articulates that passage from the documentary to the strange and fictional in a very brilliant way. So maybe before coming to this last important figure or very central figure of Singapore Mon Amour, which is Ho Sun Yen, because he's probably one of the most prominent Singaporean artists and filmmakers who revisits constantly Singapore's history. I would maybe just conclude that this whole project was really conducted as an empirical research. It was extremely enjoyable to be as free as I have never been before when conducting such a project, because the history writing is still relatively new. To my knowledge, such an experimental film program has not been conducted before. Of course, there were a lot of experimental film programs before, but let's say with this ambition. So it was really fabulous to develop this together with all these intellectuals, filmmakers and artists from Singapore, and then also our French counterparts who contributed also and mirrored somehow what we brought from Singapore to France. There is also an online publication. Is there an internet access or maybe not? Okay, so if you are interested, you can go to Low Wave's website. There is the complete online publication of Singapore Mon Amour that includes a lot of information on the film programs, but also podcasts. For example, we invited a lot of artists to talk to each other. So there's a podcast conversation of Tan Pin Pin and Jason Su, for example, where they speak about their desire to create political films. There are also critical texts, for example, by Wen Xie Tsang from the International Film Festival. There are contributions by other critiques, Catherine Weir, for example, from the Pompidou Center, Australian curator, who has written a major text on Ho Sun Yen that you can find there. And of course, also recordings of the events that we organized in Paris, the performances in the Gothic Church, the colloquium at the Musée du Quai Branly. I want to just mention this because for me, this project is just the beginning of a bigger research. That's also why we had chosen to publish online and not in the form of a book, because it's really more this idea of a platform that can grow, where we can also readjust, where we can add new content. So feel free, if you have a stronger interest in that project, just to have a look of what is already there. But coming now to Ho Sun Yen, I think he's really undoubtedly one of Singapore's most interesting artists when it comes to this idea of nation building and how we look at history. His practice as an artist, filmmaker, and also art writer since 2003 often focuses on the blind spots of history, things that we kind of know but not really know. So he asks this question again. And what is interesting, or what I particularly like in his films, is the way how he communicates his ideas on a also emotional level, or using all these techniques, the magic of cinema, the strength of sound, and so on. So it's not just the intellectual approach, but also a very sensorial and emotional approach in his films. And also the way how he critically reflects on the idea of communication itself. So a lot of his works deal also with this question of how we name things or how we don't name things. He's always very critical also about the power of words and how we declare certain things. So when I talked to him recently, he told me that he's no longer interested at the moment in shooting new images, but he's rather interested in working with new animation techniques and also found footage material. So that's why we have decided also to show you one example of a recent film that is called The Nameless that he accomplished last year. But before moving to this final work, I would like to show you an extract of the artist talk that we organized with him at the Pompidou, where he speaks about Utama.
So, but it's always good to start at the beginning. So the first work that I would like to speak a little bit about is the first work that I made, called Utama, Every Name in History is I. And incidentally, it was my first kind of like a show in Singapore. And I also thought that it would be good to start my practice in Singapore with a work that is about the beginning of Singapore, the origins of Singapore. So if you speak to most people in Singapore and you ask them when does Singapore begin, the usual answer you would get is 1819, which is the year that Singapore was founded by the British, by the East India Company. And I've always found it puzzling that we treat the moment of colonization as the moment of our origins. And if you ask most people who is the founder of Singapore, most people in Singapore, the answer you are likely to get is Sir Stamford Raffles. So this is one of the images that I produced from this exhibition. So the exhibition really consisted of 20 paintings and a film. So what we are looking at here is Sir Stamford Raffles, who was an agent of the East India Company, supposedly that we sort of in Singapore treat as the founder of Singapore. And it seems almost as though we treat the years before Raffles, before the coming of the British, as though there was nothing in Singapore, as though there was no history, as though there was, it was almost like a void in Singapore before that. So that got me curious, and I wanted to spend some time to kind of understand what was there before the coming of the British. And before Singapore had its name, Singapore, which actually comes from Sanskrit, it actually means, as most of you might know, a lion city. Singa, it's lion in Sanskrit, and Pura is a city. But before Singapura, we did have another name, which you can see circled there. Singapore is very small. It's inside the red circle. You see the name Temasek, which is kind of an older name. So if Singapore has an older name, it means that there must be something, kind of in the past. And that was one of my starting points. So a good approach is to think, when does Singapore get its name? When did it transit from Temasek to Singapore? And that has a lot to do with this figure who's called Sang Nila Utama. So the project is named after him. Utama, Every Name in History is I. So this is another of the paintings that I produced for this exhibition. So in a sense, in Singapore, we don't really know very much about this figure, Sang Nila Utama. He's a little bit relegated into the realm of kitsch and myth. But at the same time, he was the namer of Singapore, the person who gave Singapore its current name. The little that we know about him in Singapore, it usually involves a couple of sort of events in his life. One of the key things that we know about is that while Sang Nila Utama was sailing to Singapore, his ship met with a huge storm. And the only way that he could apparently save the whole ship was by throwing his crown into the sea. So the crown is supposed to be descended from Alexander the Great. So it's kind of convenient that he arrives in a new place without a crown. It's kind of maybe a democratic gesture, but it's also a way that he could kind of start fresh, start as someone new. So this was another of the incidents that I produced a painting to kind of mark this moment. So this is another painting of Sangnila Utama. It's also interesting that the person who gave Singapore its name has many names himself. So if you kind of look at literature sort of engaging with this period, he's often known by a variety of different names, such as Sri Tribuana. Some people say he's Iskandar Shah. So it's even quite difficult to map out exactly who he is or which century he actually arrived in Singapore. So the other event which was important for us was Utama spotting a lion upon the shores of Singapore. So after he threw his crown, his ship arrived in Singapore, and the story is that they saw a great beast on the shores, and somebody told him this was a lion, and so he decided to name Singapore the Lion City. So that's kind of how we got our name. But the only problem is that we don't really have any lions in Singapore. So lions are completely not indigenous to that region, to this part of the world. What we did have a lot of, however, were tigers, which I will speak a little bit about later. So in a sense, just a short quotation from a historian, the very name Singapura was a paradox, for no lion had ever set foot in this lion city.
So yeah, just this extract to give you also an idea of how we try to go beyond the simple film screenings or the showing of the artworks and really try to also produce an additional and new discourse on the works and together with the artists. This whole session at the Pompidou is also online. We had a first presentation with Sukun Ang and then him, and then later a discussion with a couple of French intellectuals. One of his latest films, The Nameless, deals with a very emblematic figure, a spy, a certain light tech that was the Secretary General of the Malayan Communist Party, and who was also a triple agent working for the French, the British, and later the Japanese. So this very intriguing film that we will show you now is composed only of films from Hong Kong cinema, which is also for Hu Tsun-yen probably the cinema that deals most with these double agents and these emblematic figures. So it's also a celebration of cinema and not just a critical point of view of on this particular figure. And I think we will later in the Q&A have some time to speak about this film more in detail. So thank you very much for now.